The moment of liberation, for so many survivors of the Holocaust, was not an end, but a beginning of a new and profoundly uncertain chapter. The images that Allied soldiers burned into their memories as they entered the camps, the piles of corpses, the bones, the human ashes, the undeniable evidence of mass murder, were mirrored by the living, breathing human beings they found still there. Thousands of Jewish and non-Jewish survivors suffering from the most extreme starvation and disease, their bodies and spirits pushed to the absolute brink. For these survivors, the sheer scale of the trauma they had endured made the prospect of rebuilding their lives an almost unimaginably daunting task. The world they had known was gone, and the world that remained was often hostile and unwelcoming. One of the most immediate and painful realities was the question of where to go. The simple idea of returning home, a dream that had sustained many through the darkest hours, was, for a vast number of Jewish survivors, a dangerous and terrifying prospect. The antisemitism, the deep-seated hatred of Jews that had fueled the Nazi regime, had not simply vanished with the end of the war. It persisted, virulently, in many parts of Europe. The trauma of what they had suffered was compounded by a very real and present fear for their physical safety should they try to reclaim their former homes. This was not an abstract fear, it was a reality borne out by violent events. In post-war Poland, for instance, there were a number of pogroms, which are violent anti-Jewish riots. The largest and most brutal of these occurred in the town of Kielce in 1946. There, Polish rioters killed at least 42 Jews and beat many others, a horrific event that served as a grim and unmistakable message to survivors that for many, there was no home to return to. With the doors to their former lives slammed shut by violence and persistent hatred, and with few possibilities for immediate emigration to new countries, tens of thousands of homeless Holocaust survivors began a westward migration. They moved toward the European territories that had been liberated by the Western Allies, the United States, Great Britain, and France. It was in these zones of occupation that a vast, temporary network of refugee centers and displaced persons camps was established. One of the most famous of these was the camp at Bergen-Belsen in Germany, a site of unspeakable suffering during the war that was now transformed into a place of refuge, however imperfect. These camps, known as DP camps, were administered by a combination of international bodies like the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, or UNRRA, and the occupying armies themselves. At the end of 1946, the number of Jewish displaced persons was estimated to be around 250,000 souls. Of this number, approximately 185,000 were in Germany, 45,000 in Austria, and 20,000 in Italy. This was a massive population of uprooted people. The majority of these Jewish DPs were refugees from Poland, many of whom had managed to survive by fleeing east from the Germans into the interior of the Soviet Union during the war. Others came from Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania. They were a community forged in shared tragedy, living in a state of limbo, housed in camps that were never meant to be permanent homes. These camps became complex communities, places where people tried to piece together some semblance of normal life, where they married, had children, and began the long, slow process of mourning, all while grappling with the immense uncertainty of their future. A considerable number and a wide variety of Jewish agencies worked tirelessly to assist this surviving remnant. The American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, often simply called the Joint or JDC, was instrumental in providing Holocaust survivors with the most basic necessities: food, clothing, and medicine. Meanwhile, the Organization for Rehabilitation Through Training, known as ORT, offered vital vocational training, giving survivors practical skills they could use to build new lives wherever they might eventually settle. The refugees themselves were not passive recipients of this aid. They actively formed their own organizations, advocating for their needs and their future. A central focus of their political and personal energy was the labor for the establishment of an independent Jewish state in Palestine, which they saw as an ultimate safe haven. The largest of these survivor organizations was called ha-Pletah, a Hebrew term meaning the surviving remnant. This organization pressed aggressively for greater emigration opportunities, as the legal paths out of Europe were frustratingly narrow. Opportunities for legal immigration to the United States, for example, were still constrained by the existing quota restrictions that had been in place before the war. The dream of going to Palestine was also blocked. The British government, which held the mandate over Palestine, severely restricted Jewish immigration there. Furthermore, many borders across Europe itself remained firmly closed to these homeless people, leaving them trapped in the displaced persons camps, their lives on hold. This period also saw the rise of organized, clandestine efforts to facilitate the exodus of Jewish refugees. The Jewish Brigade Group, which was a Palestinian Jewish unit of the British Army formed in late 1944, played a key role. Together with former partisan fighters who had been displaced in Central Europe, the Jewish Brigade Group helped create an organization called the Brihah, a Hebrew word for flight or escape. The Brihah was a clandestine movement that aimed to smuggle Jewish refugees out of Europe and into Palestine, often through dangerous and illegal routes. At the same time, Jews already living in Palestine organized what was known as illegal immigration by ship, a movement also called Aliyah Bet. This was a desperate, hopeful, and perilous undertaking. The British authorities, however, were determined to enforce their immigration restrictions. They intercepted and turned back most of these vessels carrying Holocaust survivors. One of the most famous and poignant examples of this policy involved the ship called the Exodus 1947. In 1947, the British forced the ship, which was carrying 4,500 Holocaust survivors who were headed for Palestine, to return to Germany. The image of these survivors, who had just endured the horrors of the camps, being forcibly returned to the very soil of their persecutors, sent a shockwave around the world and became a powerful symbol of the Jewish plight. In most cases, when the British intercepted these ships, they would detain the Jewish refugees who were denied entry into Palestine in detention camps on the Mediterranean island of Cyprus. So, even after surviving the genocide, survivors found themselves once again behind barbed wire, their quest for freedom and a homeland delayed. A major turning point finally came with the establishment of the State of Israel in May of 1948. Almost immediately, Jewish displaced persons and refugees began streaming into the new sovereign state, which welcomed them as citizens. This was the fulfillment of a long-held dream for many. It is estimated that by 1953, possibly as many as 170,000 Jewish displaced persons and refugees had immigrated to Israel, where they could begin anew, contributing to the building of a nation that promised a future free from persecution. The United States also eventually became a major destination, though the process was slower and governed by legislation. In December of 1945, President Harry Truman issued a directive that specifically loosened the existing quota restrictions on immigration to the United States for persons who had been displaced by the Nazi regime. Under this compassionate directive, more than 41,000 displaced persons were able to immigrate to the United States. Of that number, approximately 28,000 were Jews. This was a significant step, but the need was far greater. In response, the United States Congress passed the landmark Displaced Persons Act of 1948. This act provided a substantial allocation of approximately 400,000 U.S. immigration visas for displaced persons, which were issued between January 1, 1949, and December 31, 1952. Of the 400,000 displaced persons who entered the United States under this DP Act, approximately 68,000 were Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, who were finally able to find a permanent and safe home in America. The aftermath of the Holocaust, therefore, was a period defined not just by the trauma of what had been lost, but by the immense struggle to secure a future. The survivors, having endured the unimaginable, then faced years of uncertainty in displaced persons camps, fought against closed borders and restrictive immigration policies, and ultimately, through a combination of personal resilience, clandestine organizing, and shifting international policies, managed to find new homes across the globe. Their journey from liberation to resettlement was a testament to the enduring human will to live, to rebuild, and to find a place of safety and peace after the world had shown them its very darkest face.